Hey, my name is Mike, and in this video, I want to talk about Legion. I want to give my overall impression of it now that we're only a few days away from the end of its lifespan, and I want to talk about the things I did and did not like about it, and then I want to talk about Battle For Azeroth, what I think of it so far based off my experiences in the beta, and also my hopes and concerns about it. This is by no means a video you need to actively watch, so feel free to minimize it and just listen if you want. Prior to making this video, I went back and I watched my video from 2016, a week before Legion came out, where I talked about what I was expecting and hoping for from Legion. In that video, I talked about how I wasn't at all excited, partly because of how jaded I had become after playing through Warlords. I said that I was only really excited about launch week because I like racing to max level and getting geared quickly, but that isn't specific to Legion. WoD sucked and I still had a lot of fun in the first week. An important note that I made in that video is that I thought Legion needed to be at worst pretty good to get rid of the bad taste of WoD, and it was the expansion that in my opinion could restore WoW to any sort of glory or further destroy its legacy and intrigue. Looking back over the last 2 years, I feel comfortable saying that it was at least good. It wasn't the greatest expansion, but it definitely went a long way in mending my, and I'm sure many other people's, cynicism towards Blizzard. So now I want to talk about specific things that we saw in Legion. The first thing I want to talk about is the leveling experience in the zones in Legion. This was the first time we've ever been afforded the luxury of picking which zone we wanted to level in instead of having to be in a specific zone. Personally, I really enjoyed that for a couple of reasons. Firstly, some zones just straight up suck, so having the option to avoid these zones for as long as possible was a very welcome change. Secondly, just from a logical standpoint, this was pretty brilliant on Blizzard's part. In the past, we saw hundreds of thousands of players rush into the exact same zone at the exact same time, which inevitably caused server instability and frustration amongst players, and I'm sure Blizzard themselves. With this more democratic approach, those hundreds of thousands of players were suddenly being split amongst 4 zones, which mitigated some of the drastic impact that servers were facing. I'm sure there were other things Blizzard did to keep the servers stable, and I'm sure they learned a lot from the WoD launch, but I truly believe this had to be a huge help for them. The leveling experience itself wasn't anything great. I don't really know if there's anything you can do to make questing more fun, it's just one of those tedious things you need to get done. One thing I disliked was that the bonus objectives were reduced in quantity, and XP from them was also nerfed. I kinda get the XP nerf, even though I still think it was a bit drastic, but I do wish there were more bonus objectives sprinkled throughout each zone like there were in Draenor. It was a nice extra thing to be able to do in addition to quests in the area and get a bit of a boost in XP. The zones were also a reason that I didn't really enjoy leveling all that much. Azuna was probably the easiest to get around and the only one I actually enjoyed. Valshara was decent, but then High Mountain and Stormheim were both awful. I'm well aware of why High Mountain looks the way it does, but it's just a pain in the ass to get around. And then Stormheim with that ridiculous grappling mechanic, I sincerely hated everything about both those zones. And can I just take a second to quickly mention the maps in Legion? Who the hell designed these maps? What is even going on in the High Mountain map? How is anyone supposed to use this as a navigation tool? It's so exaggerated, so overdone, and so hard to read. If you couldn't tell, I get pretty irritated just thinking about it. Compare High Mountain's map to the simplicity of Shadowmoon Valley and Outland, for example. All the maps from this time period were really easy to read. I really wish Blizzard would knock it off with these overproduced maps and go back to basics. I don't need to see mountain details on the map, just tell me where the mountain is and I'm sure I'll figure it out. Next, I want to talk about artifacts. In 2016, I said they were pretty cool and I appreciated all the work going into the designs. I said that the talent tree would offer more sense of progression for people, and I also said that I wanted to level alts just so I could get the coolest artifact appearance for them. Oh boy. So artifacts ended up being something different than what I had anticipated. I thought they were an interesting concept, and I'm still very impressed by how many designs they were able to come up with in total. When it comes to the progression that I thought artifacts would provide though, I definitely had the wrong idea. The artifact talent tree was a nice throwback to the original talent trees and an okay way to feel like you were progressing, but the main aspect of your artifact was your concordance level, and I despise infinite progression. I just find that infinite progression like this is such a lazy design that masks the lack of depth put into an idea. I can appreciate the soft cap put on concordance by making it harder to level past a certain point, at times to the point where it wasn't even worth your time trying to farm AP. However, all this did was introduce some frustration because when I actually wanted to progress further, I felt no reward in doing so because I would spend weeks just to get an additional 300 strength, which really did nothing. And I was completely aware of how pointless my effort was, but therein lies the problem. Why have infinite progression if eventually effort is pointless? I would have much preferred to have an actual hard cap on concordance and have it be something like 1 or 2 levels past where it starts to get annoying, so that way I truly felt like I was accomplishing something. Getting level 80 concordance was nice for a second until I started working towards 81. And as for artifacts making me want to play my alts, I actually laughed out loud when I heard that. It's because of artifacts that Legion is considered by many, myself included, the most alt unfriendly expansion ever. It was a pain in the ass having to level 2 DPS artifacts artifacts, let alone log on to another character and level that artifact to anything worthwhile, even with high artifact knowledge. And actually, that's something that I want to touch on too. Before Legion came out, Blizzard said they weren't going to make any drastic class changes because they recognized how annoying it would be to put all of your effort into one artifact, then have to start over in a different spec because they nerfed something. But I know that there were some classes that had to deal with that exact thing, Warriors being one of them. There were periods of time where Fury was so far ahead of Arms that I would rage quit after Raid Night because I was so pissed off. Arms actually started the expansion better than Fury. I didn't expect it to stay that way. I figured if anything they would be evened out and would both be viable, but with one that kind of was better than the other. So when they nerfed Arms, I started to gear up Fury. But as soon as I got close to being completely geared in Fury, Arms became the best spec again, so I had to now re-gear and once again switch which artifact I was dumping AP into. And then Fury just became better again anyway. It was such a frustrating experience that really took what I initially thought was going to be a great idea and made it one of the worst things about Legion. Speaking of things that made Legion terrible, let's talk about legendaries. The expansion first comes out and you need to be in a spec to get a legendary for that spec, and your legendary drop chance is just 1%. So numerous times in my guild, I saw someone like a healer get a DPS legendary because that's what they were in while they were doing world quests. And because of that, they were now screwed for about 2 weeks until their next legendary dropped. Fortunately, though not soon enough, Blizzard changed this so that each spec had its own drop percentage and you could just set your loot specialization to get your legendary. That was definitely nice, but it didn't change the fact that the legendary system was flawed for a couple of other reasons. Firstly, when specs got buffed or nerfed, in addition to having to start gearing up a new spec and having to refarm a bunch of AP to get your artifacts to a good place, you now also had to get the right legendaries for that spec. And that's what the second issue was, the fact that it was strictly up to RNG which legendary you got. Even if you had the highest artifact level and the best gear in your raid, you could be underperforming without the right legendaries. And there was nothing you could do about that. You can spend all day, every day farming legendaries only to get a PvP legendary, or the worst legendary for that spec, or a utility legendary like Pride has, or a legendary that was good, but it wasn't the best one. The legendary system was flawed in a major way and was the main source of negativity surrounding people's experiences in Legion. I'm really surprised it remained mostly unchanged up until the end. I think I'm more surprised that the system made it past quality control. Getting the right legendary was such an amazing feeling, but oftentimes for all the wrong reasons. So from there, let's move into something a bit more positive. I have heard expansion after expansion after expansion how Blizzard wants to make dungeons more relevant throughout the entirety of an expansion, and time after time they fail to deliver on that. And it's hard to even blame them. How are you supposed to make dungeons fun for a mythic raider? You just can't. They tried adding in Valor points for upgrading your gear, but that was short-lived once you got all your gear upgraded. They tried adding mythic difficulty at the end of WoD and no one cared. They had challenge modes which were definitely hard but not very rewarding, especially if you don't care about transmog. And even if you only care about transmog, once you get gold once, you were done. Enter Mythic Plus. They took the basic idea of challenge modes and really expanded upon it, adding different tiers of difficulties that scaled with you and scaled upwards, not downwards. And most importantly, they made Mythic Plus rewarding for everyone, for an entire expansion. Depending on how quickly you finish the dungeon, you can get some nice gear and some artifact power for your troubles. But the meat of this equation, the prize, was truly the reward you got at the start of next week. You could get gear that was equal to, or in some cases even better than the gear you could get raiding. I've probably only done 20 Mythic Pluses in Legion, and it's been almost 2 years since my last one probably, but even I can confidently say that Mythic Plus is probably one of, if not the greatest addition to not only Legion, but WoW in general. Blizzard made dungeons relevant for an entire expansion. They justifiably gave you raid gear in a dungeon. But the raiders didn't care because you got one piece a week, so you weren't going to be outperforming them anytime soon. And they also got one piece a week, so all of a sudden they were doing more DPS even though they may not have gotten any gear from the raid last week. But on top of that, Mythic Plus has reintroduced WoW into the esports community with the Mythic Dungeon Invitational, which I'm pretty sure is the most popular WoW has ever been in an esport. As for the dungeons themselves, I didn't think any of them were particularly incredible. There were probably more dungeons I disliked this expansion than any other. Visually though, a lot of them looked cool. But overall I really enjoyed Return to Karazhan, Darkheart, Thicket, and Maw of Souls. I like how every patch introduced a new dungeon for us to get into. I like how the Suramar dungeons and the dungeons introduced in patches started as mythic only and you had to unlock them. I'm also very critical and dislike bringing back old dungeons as a trip down memory lane, so because of that, Violet Hold sucks, and I mean it did originally too. But when it came to Karazhan returning, I thought Blizzard did a great job with paying homage to the original but also introducing something new. Switching from dungeons to raids, I thought Legion continued where WoD left off with raids, and that's definitely a good thing. In 2016, I said that I wanted raids to be paced well. I think in Legion the pacing left a little bit to be desired. Emerald Nightmare opened on September 20th, Trial of Valor about 2.5 months later on November 8th, Nighthold came out 2 months later on January 17th, Tomb of Sargeras 5 months later on June 20th, and Antorus 5 months after that on November 29th. And by the time BFA is released, it'll have lasted just shy of 9 months. Both Emerald Nightmare and Trial of Valor were short-lived, and I think they could have gone on longer. I know they were kind of seen as the same tier, so to speak, or one raid cycle, but I would have enjoyed spending some more time in them. And I think that had the release schedule looked a bit different, it would have felt a little less rushed in terms of how fast content was coming out. I think by changing the release schedule a bit, they could have made each raid cycle last about the same time with a little bit extra for Antorus as it's the last raid. In 2016, I also said 2 more things in regards to raids. First, I said I wanted to have at least 4. We got 5, or 4.5 if you don't count TOV as 1. Second, I said that I wanted the last raid to last a maximum of 9 months. I would accept a year, but only if Blizzard gave us something to do in the meantime. They did both of those things, so they get a passing grade from me. Mechanically, I enjoyed a lot of the bosses, and I think Legion provided us with some of the most difficult and fun raid fights ever, especially from a mythic standpoint. Elwreath Renfurl was a relatively simple fight, but there was something about it that I really enjoyed. I loved all the movement and precision required to be successful. I enjoyed Cenarius for a similar reason. There was just so much going on, and you needed to be able to think quick and multitask. It was the first roadblock of the expansion, and rightfully so. Odin was a unique boss fight with the rune mechanic that on Mythic you had to actually do with members of your raid as well, which was super fun learning. Gul'dan was a fun fight for the precision required, the specific timings, and how your entire raid needed to work together to not screw each other over, and the multitasking required in the later stages. Kil'jaeden remains, in my opinion, probably one of the hardest bosses ever. From the soak mechanic to the dark mechanic to the pillars to the balls on Mythic that I never got to see. I've never been more happy to kill a boss than I was this dumb idiot. Kingaroth was one of the better stationary boss fights, and I really enjoyed the purple ball mechanic. I love boss fights where you get to pick how hard you make it on yourself. It's like a throwback to the Alduar days. In Argus, the final boss of the expansion, that fight was a pain in the ass in the best way. I love how each phase got harder and harder, and Mythic Argus required some serious coordination and attention to detail. My favorite part about Mythic Argus was that there was no ad phase though. In terms of my actual enjoyment of each raid, it varied. Emerald Nightmare was okay overall. Visually, in my opinion, it was the best raid. Some of the bosses left a lot to be desired, but being the first raid of an expansion, I can give it a pass for that. I think Nithentro was a weird boss just because of what the rest of the raid looked like. Mechanically, I thought it was fine for the first boss of an expansion. It was actually a difficult boss for some people for some reason. It seemed like a great test for guilds, mine included, to see who has spatial awareness and who is just tunneling the boss. The rest of the bosses were hit or miss with me. The ones that weren't in the previous list of good bosses were either okay bosses or ones I didn't like. One boss I particularly hated was Xavius. First of all, I remember watching beta footage of that fight and seeing what the room looked like and wondering what Blizzard was going to add, but then I got to Xavius on live servers and the room looked the exact same. This bland, white, and foggy room. I understand we're in the dream and stuff, but that was such a boring room to fight in. But couple that with how easy Xavius was, that was just a complete letdown. My guild and many others struggled weeks on Cenarius only to kill Xavius in a couple of hours on Mythic. I would have liked to have seen Xavius be more difficult, especially considering he's the last boss of the raid and the boss before him was such a pain in the ass. Trial of Valor was probably my favorite raid this expansion, but I think the reason for that is because it was only relevant for such a short amount of time, so I never got a chance to get sick of running it over and over and over again. Visually, everything after Odin wasn't that interesting. Mechanically, I really enjoyed most of the fights here. I touched on Odin earlier. Gorm was just boring. I didn't really find any of his mechanics all that interesting or difficult. Hell yeah was a lot of fun to learn, but when I think of the mechanics, none of them were really that cool. It was largely an ad fight, which I'm generally not a fan of. There was a lot of ways for other people to kill you or screw the raid, such as Rot, Orbs, Taint of the Sea, and that thing in the middle of the room that spawned ads. There was a lot of ways to have frustrating wipes, which is never fun. Nighthold is hard to think of objectively because it was during this tier that I took a small break from WoW because grinding AP just sucked the fun out of the game for me. But overall, I think I enjoyed the raid aesthetically and mechanically. I just very quickly grew tired of it when I was actually raiding it though. The first 3 bosses are easily the worst in this raid. Boring mechanics and very dull visuals. Chronomatic Anomaly in particular is probably the only fight in WoW where I would beg my raid leader to sit me. I hate that fight and everything about it. The time mechanic where you slow down or speed up is cool in theory, but in practice it was easily the most annoying thing to deal with in a raid ever. From the very first time I pulled that boss, I never wanted to do it again. I hate this boss, and I'm very thankful my raid leader obliged my request as often as he did. After that though, the raid really started to come to life. Star Augur is visually the most beautiful and jaw-dropping fight in the game. Nothing else holds a candle to this fight. Quite opposite of Chronomatic Anomaly, I loved coming in for this fight. The mechanics had a bit of difficulty in them, but visually, just my god, I loved every second of this fight. I have negative feelings towards Botanist because of the hour of trash beforehand. However, looking back now, that fight was actually pretty intense and a lot of fun, especially on Mythic. On Mythic, that's exactly the kind of fight that I love. So much stuff going on and needing yourself and your entire raid to not suck for 10 or more minutes straight. Besides Gul'dan, the rest of the fights were just okay, I guess. Tomb of Sargeras was not very good at all in my opinion. The majority of the fights were forgettable and easily became tedious to do once you were farming them. Mistress Sassy was kind of cool, but the limited camera distance really made that fight difficult to enjoy, especially with all the crap going on. Desolate Host was an ad fight that kind of works similar to Gothic the Harvester and Nax. In my opinion, both fights suck and are very boring. Maiden Vigilance was another Nax-inspired fight, loosely based on Thaddeus. It was an okay fight that modified the original mechanic enough to make it kind of enjoyable. Like I said earlier, Kill Jaden I thought was a fun fight and the only one I enjoyed in this raid. I just really wish that soak mechanic wasn't so punishing during progression. And then we close with Antorus, which I really don't know if it's because of the duration or what, but I think this was the worst raid of Legion. Mythic Fellhounds was kind of enjoyable with the requirement to stack with your dog. High Command was such a boring fight that felt like it went on for hours. There was really nothing going on, just a bunch of bombs and dealing with one new mechanic each time the boss changed. Like I said earlier, I hate ad fights, so ENR was the worst boss fight in this raid. If you could even call it that, it was kind of just glorified trash packs. Any other boss I didn't mention yet is either meh or forgettable. Visually, this raid was also an eyesore just because of the dullness and the darkness and the green that it had. I just didn't really like this raid, even from day one. So from there, I'll just finish with some things I don't have much to say about but wanted to mention. Order halls were a pretty big departure from WoD garrisons in terms of how much time we spent there and what they were for. I enjoyed that each class had their own hall, but I never once felt like I was in a community with other like-minded people, partially because due to sharding, there were only ever like 15 people in Skyhold with me. I think the companion app was a great idea because it was nice to be able to do missions while I wasn't at my computer. The missions themselves were fine too. It was nice having less than in WoD and ones that rewarded me with actual stuff to do out in the world. One thing I wish the companion app allowed was using that auto-complete world quest thing. That would have been sweet. I enjoyed the slight change to professions where most things had a rank which would reduce the amount of materials you needed to spend. It was a small bit of progression you had and it was nice being able to save some mats. I think Paragon Rep was actually a pretty good idea. Prior to that, you would just do world quests or something and it would just be that. But now with Paragon Reps, you'd be working towards a cache which had some nice rewards in it for everyone. So again, just another sense of progression for people. It wasn't mandatory to do, but if you worked towards it, you would be rewarded, which is always nice. The way they dealt with flying was similar to WoD, except this time there was far better and more accurate communication with the community, so that was a breath of fresh air. Personally, I wish I could fly around as soon as I hit max level because I hate using my ground mount, but this looks like a change they're sticking with, and the majority of people seem to be happy with it, so I guess it's nothing I can't live with. I like the way PvP talents worked in Legion. I know balancing abilities around both PvE and PvP has been difficult for Blizzard in the past, and I'm not entirely sure if this helped them, but I personally enjoyed having more talents to choose from when I did PvP. Honor level was kind of set to be this high cap like Diablo's Paragon levels when they were released, which essentially was just infinite progression with rewards at the end of each level. I like the rewards, but like I said earlier, I really hate infinite progression, so the honor level system was pretty lame to me. World quests were a nice replacement for daily quests. I actually enjoyed doing them. They were relaxing and offered a good award regardless of how geared I was, even if that award was a Chaos Crystal or AP. In 2016, I said how I was worried they would become mandatory to obtain AP, which I'm glad I was wrong about. They were definitely a great source of AP, but not mandatory by any means. There wasn't too much variety with the world quests, but they were all pretty quick to do, so I never really minded them. Apparently, Kirin Tor quests are universally hated, but I actually thought they were the best world quests and really enjoyed doing them, besides the Mana Saber riding quest. I'd love to see those kinds of quests return in BFA. I love the numerous secret pets and mounts in Legion. It was so much fun seeing the community come together to try and find these oftentimes obscure and ridiculous answers to cryptic clues. The only thing I hated was the Lucid Nightmare maze because it was so hard and annoying, but thankfully I had someone helping me and calming me down as soon as I got frustrated. I really hope we see more secrets in BFA. Mount collectors love them, and it's just an extra little thing to do that's a lot of fun and takes you back to numerous random places around the world. And much to my surprise and my delight, Blizzard learned how to pace themselves and be 3 steps ahead, which I said would give Legion potential. Blizzard better communicated changes, better addressed the community's issues, and were open to good feedback this expansion, something I said was very important. I think Ian's Q&As and just public presence in general was very welcomed, especially after Warlords, and I think that because of this, the expansion came across as for the players rather than for our investors. And finally, in 2016, I said that at the end of Legion, I wanted to make this kind of video, but talk about how I wasn't hyped at all for it, and it blew me out of the water. I wanted to talk about how great the expansion was and how I'm looking forward to 8.0, but will miss Legion. I wasn't hyped for Legion, and it didn't blow me out of the water, but it did impress me, and it made me believe Blizzard actually cares about Warcraft and the people who play it. It wasn't great, it was good. I can't say that I'm looking forward to 8.0, but that's not because Legion sucked and BFA looks like it'll suck. I just don't see anything to get very excited over, but I'm sure I'll enjoy it, and I don't think I'll miss Legion. Based on what I said in 2016, it would appear that Blizzard didn't make an expansion that lived up to my expectations, but again, that doesn't mean it was a bad expansion. I was wrong. Legion did not have to be as great as I thought it needed to be. It just needed to be better than WoD, and it absolutely was by 1,000 miles. I enjoyed my time in Legion, but not enough to be sad that the times are over, and not enough to make me excited about what lies ahead. Legion was a good expansion, and it was everything it needed to be when it needed to be. If Blizzard applies what they learned and did in Legion to BFA, I think at worst it'll be a good expansion. However, BFA doesn't need to prove anything like Legion did, so I think there's less pressure on Blizzard, which I'm really hoping doesn't mean they take their foot off the gas. In addition to that though, I think just in general people will be a little bit less critical of BFA than they were of Legion because BFA isn't fan service for shitting the bed. So let's switch gears now and talk about BFA. I won't be discussing any story spoilers here, mainly because I don't follow the story. I've had beta access since May and I've sunk a few days worth of time into it. I've leveled through the 3 Horde zones twice now and I like them a lot more than I did the Legion zones. They're still not that great, but they're definitely much better, especially with the way the quests flow together. Nazmir is probably my favorite zone of the 3. The quests aren't annoying and it's easy to get around. It's also home to the most beautiful area in WoW that I think I have ever seen. When you're leaving the frog area, take a second to admire that view. I'd rank Vol'dun second. To me, it resembles Frostfire Ridge if instead of snow it had a desert similar to Tenaris, so visually it's kind of bland and boring. The quests for the most part are okay. The further south I got, the more irritating and tedious the quests became, especially the ones around the southern port. Zoldazar I'd rank last just because I really dislike how you have to constantly go back to the main city here to start new quest lines. I just feel like it disrupts the flow of the quests, which already are kind of tedious and boring. This zone was easily the most annoying to level through once you got to a higher level due to scaling, so I'll probably level here first or second. Visually it looks okay, I don't think it's anything special though. Overall I'd say I'd like the questing process in BFA. I also like how if I wanted to, I could go level in the 3 Alliance zones after I get the first quest of the war campaign done. The 3 Alliance zones from the limited amount of time I've spent in them looked pretty cool. One thing I love seeing is when Blizzard expands upon ideas instead of ditching them altogether, so I'm happy to see an upgraded artifact system returning in BFA. Like I said, one of my biggest complaints about Legion was having to keep numerous artifacts leveled up, and it was annoying to do, especially if I was changing to a new spec. So the fact that the Heart of Azeroth is one artifact that has spec-specific talents on it is such a great change. Only having to worry about leveling one artifact and having all the Azerite I add to it apply to all specs is fantastic. I also really like the talent tree system, or whatever you want to call it, that they're using. I like how a few pieces of gear near the artifact are empowered and you get to pick some passive abilities that help you, and then finish off with a basic stat increase for the +5 eye levels. It's a modified and more creative version of the Netherlight Crucible and Argus, and I much prefer having 2 passive abilities and an item level increase to worry about than having to figure out which route is the best to take like the Legion artifacts. One thing I'm not too sure about, and maybe this has already been addressed, is how progression works for the artifact. I know that the higher level you have, the better passives you get to choose from, but what happens when you get to whatever the max level is, whether it's a soft or hard cap? If it's a soft cap, will it be like the Legion artifacts where you just hate leveling any further because it's pointless? Or is it a hard cap and once you get to level 30 for example, you're done until the next tier? Like I said earlier, I hate infinite progression, so I would love to see a hard cap in place where the last 2 to 3 levels are pretty tedious and grindy to get. I don't think this should be mandatory, but I think the hard cap should definitely provide some sort of noticeable benefit. At the moment it looks like BFA will be without legendaries, which I hope is the way they plan on keeping it. I think having one expansion without any legendaries would be a nice change of pace. I really despise the legendaries from MoP and WoD and how they were gated over the entire expansion. If you were behind in the questline, it was annoying to catch up. Once you ended up getting your legendary, it was more of a relief that it was over instead of happiness that you got it. And I definitely did not like the Legion legendary system. I think Blizzard is done releasing class-specific legendaries because it's hard to balance those classes, and personally, I don't really mind that. I hope BFA stays without legendaries, but if Blizzard has plans for them, they announce them early and give out specific information about how they're obtained so that the community can provide input that hopefully they will listen to. I've done each of the BFA dungeons numerous times on Heroic, and I've only done one Mythic dungeon once. Overall, I'd say that I like about half of them, both mechanically and visually. Right now, my favorite dungeon is Waycrest Manor because it looks amazing and the mechanics are pretty fun, but because of the length of it, I can see it becoming a dungeon that quickly falls from grace. Tol Dagor and Underrot are other dungeons that I enjoyed as well. I don't think any of the dungeons will blow people's minds, but I also don't think people will hate them, myself included. I think we've got a good batch of release day dungeons, both in terms of quality and quantity. I like seeing the mythic only dungeons return and having a gated quest line required for them. Also, just a really quick note on Mythic Plus. I like that they're adding some more fixes and continuing to improve something they knocked out of the park in Legion. They probably could have left Mythic Plus alone and most people would have been happy, but it's nice to see them not getting complacent. I've only done one island expedition in Warfront and I wasn't really a fan of either one of them. Expeditions had some weird scaling issues where some mobs weren't hard but the very next one would hit like a truck, and I hope they can figure that out. And the content itself wasn't something I enjoyed. I don't really have any specific reason, I just found it boring and not something I was looking forward to having to do for Azeroth. I think I'd enjoy them more if they were shorter or if there were more things to do more often than just running around a lot. Warfronts were kind of similar in that I just didn't find it that fun. I don't like RTS games, so being a pawn in an RTS inspired game mode isn't something that gets me giddy. I think the more people do them, the more strats we'll get, and eventually they'll be a bit quicker than when I did it. My least favorite thing was having to constantly retake bases and how slowly the game advanced. I was also disappointed to see this was a PvE game mode. I really hope they introduce PvP mode to Warfronts in the future. The raids in BFA I'm not really worried about at all. If there's one thing that Blizzard has done well time after time, it's raids. From the very little beta testing I've done, as well as some of the videos I've watched, I think Uldir looks pretty cool visually. I think the color scale is pretty heavy towards gray, so I wonder how quickly I'll get tired of seeing that. The bosses themselves look cool and have some interesting mechanics that I'm looking forward to learning and mastering, and I think that they finally found a raid scaling situation that both they and most people like. Personally, I'm okay with Mythic staying as a 20-player option with no foreseeable option to scale down to 10 or 15. I think that if they end up changing Mythic to 10 or 15 players in addition to 20, I just hope they scale it so there isn't another set of gear like normal, heroic, baby mythic, and mythic. Just make it all mythic. I also hope they make cross-realm mythic happen sooner than they did in Legion. To be honest, I think even 2 or 3 months after the raid has come out is plenty of time. One last thing about raiding, the new Hall of Fame achievements for the first 100 guilds to kill the last boss on Mythic I think is a great idea. Adding some prestige back to the world first race is always fun because that's a race that I personally am always very closely monitoring. And I think giving the achievement to the top 100 is a good way to distinguish the best of the best each tier. I know part of the reason is that they wanted to diversify the Horde and Alliance ratio. I'm not sure if this achievement will be enough incentive for most guilds, but I think it's a good idea regardless. I think the change in PvP is pretty massive, and personally I am a big fan of it. I first started playing on a PvE server but transferred to a PvP server because all my friends played there. By the time all my friends quit, I was in my current guild and I loved them, so I didn't want to leave, and they also play on a PvP server. I always hated playing on a PvP server. Nothing pissed me off more quickly than when I was trying to level up or just doing a quick daily quest and some alliance would come and one-shot me or stun lock me to troll me. So the introduction of War Mode is probably one of my personal favorite changes in the game ever. I think it's a great idea to promote world PvP because you have all the people that want to do it together in a shard and they're encouraged to PvP due to the bounty system. But then people like me can just turn it off and play in peace and not have to pay for a server transfer or just rage quit whenever they're forced to do PvP. The other PvP changes that I want to talk about are the battleground changes. Seething Shore is an okay battleground. It's not great, but it's definitely not the worst. I like that it's relatively quick. The removal of Ashran and Strand of Ancients is one that I'm not a big fan of. Ashran I don't care much about because they said they're only disabling it temporarily, so it should be back eventually. But removing Strand is a change that I don't like. Personally, I didn't mind Strand at all. Before the announcement that they were removing it, I had pretty much all the achievements done. I just needed 35 wins or something like that for 100. And genuinely, I didn't mind if I got it in the random queue. I'm not entirely sure why they removed it, if it's because of the vehicles and scaling issues or something else entirely. I would prefer if they reworked it and brought it back in the future, or alternatively with the change to the queue system allowed you to continue to blacklist battlegrounds so people could disregard it if they don't like it. Speaking of the change of the queue system, I really like that they finally separated AV and Isle of Conquest into their own queue. I really hope that that queue in the future will include Wintergrasp, Tallbrad, and Ashran. Seeing as they just removed Strand, I'm not going to hold my breath for Wintergrasp though. Now, just like I did with Legion, I've got some quick notes about a bunch of different things. I really like the addition of communities. It's like having Discord servers for specific things like achievement hunting, secret finding, or just random things, but in-game, I think it's great. I'm glad that Blizzard has taken a break from player housing this expansion. I don't think they need that sort of stuff in-game. I just prefer to have one major city where everyone hangs out. I like the change to professions. It was annoying having to level an entirely new profession almost 1,000 levels, starting with irrelevant vanilla stuff. I like being able to level per expansion and only 100 levels. I hope they continue using the companion app for BFA, but I would like if they just combined it with the Armory app though. I also hope that they continue with the Paragon reps, but immediately this time, not a couple of patches in. And if they're going to be rewarding mounts from Paragon rep, maybe increase the likelihood of them dropping a bit. World quests are returning in the exact same form we had them in Legion, and I don't have any complaints about that. I'm not really a fan of the GCD change. I'm happy they took racials off the GCD, but it just feels like the game slows down with this change. And I know they said they want people to consider what's more important, damaging the boss or popping a defensive, but I think that logic is a bit flawed. A lot of times when I pop a defensive cooldown, it's a reaction to taking an unexpected large amount of damage you can't predict or prepare for. In these situations, it's going to be very annoying annoying when my defensive is on GCD and in that time I die. That's going to be the cause for a lot of frustration, I think. Popping a CD a bit earlier when I know the boss is about to do a lot of damage that I need to minimize isn't an issue. It's that unpredictable damage where because of the GCD I can't pop anything and I just end up dying. I'm also not a fan of class buffs returning, but mainly because I always forget to cast them. I wish they were just like a permanent aura each class had with them. I don't really care about the stat squish. I don't care if I see 1 million or 100 damage, 6 million health or 6,000. There is a couple of things that I think about the stat squish though. The first has to do with the scaling of older content. It's obviously very hard to get right immediately, and it's just annoying waiting for Blizzard to fix everything that they messed up, but it's also annoying going back and doing something like a mount run in Siege of Orgrimmar, and things I was one-shotting before now require me to do my rotation because the scaling is a bit weird. The second thing is something Blizzard said I think when they announced the stat squish in Warlords, that being that the stat squish back then was just a temporary fix until they came up with a better idea. I definitely don't have any suggestions to make, and I'm sure it's a difficult problem to try and solve, but I really hope that by patch 10.0 they figured out a better fix than constantly scaling down everything. 2 points of contention in BFA spawn from the removal of tier sets and the mandating of personal loot. A lot of people have said that they rated 4 tier sets, and that's understandable, but I didn't. I rated to get better gear in general, so when it comes to this change, I really don't care. In fact, I actually found it very annoying that I needed to use specific tier pieces instead of gear that had better stats just because I didn't want to break my 4-piece, so I'm actually happy that they got rid of tier. Having a 2 and 4-piece set bonus was definitely nice, but we're getting a similar system in the Heart of Azeroth, so in that regard, tier is just being modified, not completely replaced. As for mandating personal loot, I think this is something that's going to be frustrating at the start of new tiers. It's going to suck getting a piece of gear that's a higher eye level than what I currently have equipped, but doesn't have the stats I want, because in the past I would have just traded it to another raider who actually wants it. But now this piece of gear is just going to waste. And I think this is going to slow down progression a bit just because of the lack of trading. And it sounds like that's exactly what Blizzard wants, but they want that because the World First guilds all funnel gear to each other and clear everything quicker than Blizzard would like. But people have already found ways that they're going to do split runs even with this change, so I'm not entirely sure why Blizzard still wants to mandate personal loot. I don't think in dealing with World First guilds, casual guilds should need to suffer as well. It sounds like their feet are planted on this change. If they do end up changing this, I don't think we'll see that until at least the second raid is released, but I don't actually see them making that change at all. I think it's dumb and it's not doing anything positive or productive. Overall, I think BFA has the same amount of potential Legion had. I think that if they continue working away at the game like they did in Legion and provide us with a constant flow of content, most people will be satisfied. I'm a little bit worried though. BFA testing began a little late, and the rate in which they updated things and addressed them was a cause for concern. I'm really hoping that Legion wasn't too ambitious and set a bar that Blizzard themselves can't consistently reach. I think, like Legion, plenty of content and no long gaps between the content is a primary concern in WoW. When it comes to dungeons and raids, I think they've got plenty of great ideas there. I think in terms of PvP, for me anyway, as someone who only PvPs periodically and non-competitively, there seems to be enough content for me to enjoy with the war campaign, conquest farming, and warfronts. But outside of that, I hope, like Legion, BFA has fun things or progression we get to do, such as secret mounts, pets and reps, rep farming, mini-games, profession improvements. Sometimes when I logged on during Legion, I felt overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that I could do, which is a great problem to have. I'm not saying that BFA needs to give me that same feeling or overwhelm me more, but I want to be able to pick from a generous list of a variety of things to do. In summary, Legion was a good expansion. After Warlords of Draenor, the question we all had was, how is Blizzard going to fix this? I think Legion did a lot of things right and answered that question with a consistent follow-through on promises, and oftentimes exceeding what we had come to expect. Moving forward, I think BFA has a chance to excel in areas where Legion faltered and continue in an upwards trajectory. I'm not overly excited for the expansion, but I am far more optimistic and eager to get going than I was at this time 2 years ago heading into Legion. I'm letting my guard down for BFA because I think that Blizzard has earned it. I don't know what happened to them during WoD, but I think they've learned and improved a lot from it. With every expansion, there's always a handful of questions we have for Blizzard heading into the next chapter of WoW, but there's always one question in particular that stands out. Whether it was how will they fix this, how do they top this, or how will they make this work, there's always one. Going into BFA, the question, at least for me, is whether or not Legion was a one-off. Did Legion play out the way it did because of Warlords, or was Legion proof of what we can look forward to from now on? BFA will begin to answer that question, and I hope that in about 2 years I'm happily able to say that yes, Legion was a looking glass into the future. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to add your own thoughts or rebuttals, feel free to leave them in the comment section. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks again, have an excellent day, and I will see you all in Battle for Azeroth.